Margaret Holloway had been the president of the Sycamore Lane Homeowners Association for 15 years. At 62, she had nothing else in her life that gave her the same sense of purpose and control. Her husband Gerald had long ago learned to fade into the background of their marriage, and their adult children rarely visited. What Margaret did have was power over the 47 homes in the Oak Ridge Estates subdivision, and she wielded that power with an iron fist disguised in floral print blouses and perfectly coiffed silver hair. The neighbors called her HOA Karen behind her back, but to her face they smiled and nodded. Margaret's infamous clipboard contained detailed notes on every infraction: grass half an inch too tall, garbage bins left out 6 minutes past the designated retrieval time, and unauthorized wind chimes that disrupted the community aesthetic. She didn't just enforce the rules, she lived for them. Every Tuesday morning at precisely 9:30 a.m., Margaret began her inspection rounds. The residents of Oak Ridge Estates had learned to recognize the distinctive click of her kitten heels on the sidewalk, the sound serving as a warning system that sent people scurrying to adjust potted plants or hastily remove children's toys from front yards. Margaret had a particular way of pausing in front of each house, head tilted slightly as her eyes scanned methodically from roofline to foundation, missing nothing. Today was no different as she stopped before the Jenkins Colonial on the corner. Their new roof had been installed last week after 3 months of Margaret's escalating notices about the previous one's unsightly aging appearance, and she needed to verify the shingles matched the approved Oak Ridge charcoal number 37 shade exactly. She pursed her lips, squinting upward in the morning sun. Was that a hint of midnight black number 42 she detected? Margaret made a precise note, already mentally drafting the violation letter. "Good morning," Margaret called Elaine Winters from across the street where she was collecting her mail. The woman had moved in 4 years ago and still hadn't learned the proper greeting protocol. Margaret preferred Mrs. Holloway from residents unless she explicitly granted first-name privileges. "Good morning, Mrs. Winters," Margaret replied with practiced politeness, emphasizing the formal address. "I notice your hydrangeas are extending beyond the approved garden border by approximately 3 inches. Section 7, Paragraph 4 of the Landscape Guidelines clearly states that all perennials must remain within designated planting areas." Elaine's smile faltered. "Oh, I didn't realize. A friendly reminder today, but I'll need to see that addressed by Thursday's inspection." Margaret offered what she considered a generous compromise, though the clipboard already recorded the violation. She established her reputation by being thorough but fair, at least in her own assessment. Back at home, Margaret arranged her violation notices on the dining room table she converted into her command center. Gerald shuffled in with his coffee mug, careful not to disturb her meticulous piles. "Big day?" he asked, his voice carrying the soft resignation that had characterized their conversations for years. "The paddles installed a basketball hoop without approval, the Wilsons have unauthorized solar landscape lights, and someone, I suspect the teenagers at 156, has been walking through the Petersons' corner lot, creating a desired path." Margaret didn't look up as she color-coded her findings. "Standards require constant vigilance, Gerald." He nodded and retreated to his workshop in the garage, the one space Margaret considered too dusty and disorganized to properly supervise. Margaret barely noticed his departure. Her mind was already composing the agenda for next week's HOA meeting, where she would introduce her proposal for stricter holiday decoration guidelines. Last December's inflatable Santa situation would not repeat itself on her watch. The Rodriguez family moved into 238 Sycamore Lane in early spring. The moving truck had barely pulled away when Margaret positioned herself strategically by her bay window, observing the newcomers with hawk-like attention. Maria and Carlos, both emergency room doctors, directed the placement of furniture while their 2 children, Elena, 15, and Miguel, 10, explored the yard with their golden retriever named Sunny, who bounded through the grass with uninhibited joy that made Margaret frown. Pets were allowed in Oak Ridge Estates, but the HOA guidelines clearly stated they must be properly restrained and controlled at all times. The Rodriguez family had chosen Oak Ridge Estates for its good schools and proximity to the hospital where they worked alternating shifts. Their previous home had been a cramped apartment in the city, and this suburban house represented something they'd worked toward for years. Carlos had immigrated from Mexico as a teenager, putting himself through college and medical school with stubborn determination. Maria, whose parents had fled political unrest in Venezuela when she was a child, had met Carlos during their residency. Together, they built a life centered on healing others and creating a safe haven for their family. Within days of unpacking, Maria transformed the barren rectangle of their backyard into a small but lovingly arranged vegetable garden. She placed raised beds in a geometric pattern, filling them with tomato seedlings, pepper plants, and various herbs, many varieties handed down through her family for generations. Gardening was her meditation after difficult hospital shifts, and she'd already arranged a schedule that would allow her to tend to the plants each morning before the Texas heat became unbearable. On the same weekend, Elena hung a pride flag next to their front door. She had come out to her parents 3 months earlier, and their response, immediate love and support, had given her the confidence to begin expressing her identity more openly. The flag represented not just her journey, but her family's commitment to standing with her. When Carlos helped her mount it by the doorbell, he'd given her a bear hug and whispered how proud he was of her courage. Margaret noticed both additions immediately. The garden wasn't explicitly against HOA regulations, a frustrating oversight in the bylaws she'd been meaning to address, but the flag definitely violated the no flags except American and seasonal decorative rule she personally amended 4 years ago after the Thompsons had briefly displayed a sports team banner. She circled the Rodriguez home 3 times that week, iPhone in hand, meticulously documenting each potential violation from multiple angles. "Did you see what they've done?" Margaret asked her neighbor and loyal HOA board member, Patricia Whitman, during their Wednesday power walk. "Moving truck's barely gone, and they're already flaunting the rules." "Maybe they just don't know yet," Patricia suggested, slightly winded as she tried to keep pace with Margaret's determined stride. "The welcome packet does take a while to read through." "Ignorance of the regulations is no excuse," Margaret replied firmly. "Rules maintain property values. Without them, chaos ensues." She already drafted the first official warning notice, a gentle but firm introduction to how things work in Oak Ridge Estates. Margaret prided herself on giving new residents one chance to correct course before escalating to fines. It demonstrated her fairness. She believed that most recipients of her courtesy notices failed to appreciate her restraint. As Saturday morning dawned, Margaret tucked the warning letter into a cream-colored envelope embossed with the HOA logo and began her walk to 238 Sycamore Lane. From a distance, she could see Maria in the front yard planting flowers along the walkway while the unauthorized flag fluttered in the breeze. Margaret straightened her posture and quickened her pace. This would be her first official introduction to the new residents, and first impressions were everything in maintaining neighborhood authority. Margaret's knuckles rapped sharply against the door of 238 Sycamore Lane at precisely 10:00 a.m., the time she determined was late enough to be considerate, but early enough to establish the importance of her visit. She straightened her pearl necklace and adjusted her grip on the clipboard that served as both shield and weapon in neighborhood confrontations. Maria opened the door, still dressed in blue scrubs, dark circles visible beneath her eyes. She just finished a grueling overnight shift in the ER. 3 car accidents, a heart attack, and a child with severe asthma had kept her moving without breaks for 12 hours. She'd been home for exactly 20 minutes and had only taken off her shoes when the doorbell rang. "Good morning," Margaret said with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Margaret Holloway, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Welcome to the neighborhood." Maria attempted to match the smile despite her exhaustion. "Thank you. I'm Maria Rodriguez. I'd invite you in, but we're still unpacking and I just got home from work." Margaret waved away the explanation. "This won't take long. I'm here about a couple of compliance issues we've noticed." She tilted her head toward the pride flag. "Oak Ridge Estates has very specific guidelines about exterior decorations. I brought you a copy of the complete HOA handbook. It's quite comprehensive at 87 pages, but the relevant section is highlighted on page 42. Maria accepted the thick binder. Margaret thrust forward, her medical training automatically adjusting her posture to accommodate the unexpected weight. "It's not personal," Margaret continued, tapping her pen against her clipboard. "Rules are rules. The flag has to come down by Friday, and I'll need to approve your garden plans retroactively. The form for landscape modifications on page 63. Maria took a deep breath, the kind she used before delivering difficult news to patients' families. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, but I'm confused about the garden. It's within our property lines and not visible from the street." "Visibility isn't the only criterion," Margaret replied, her tone suggesting she had this conversation many times before. "Proper drainage, plant height restrictions, and aesthetic consistency all factor into approval requirements." "And the flag?" Maria asked, her voice cooling slightly. "My daughter helped pick it out. It means a lot to our family." Margaret's expression remained unchanged, though her posture stiffened. Section 7.3 clearly states that only American flags and seasonal decorative flags are permitted. A pride flag does not fall into either category. "Our daughter recently came out," Maria explained, fighting to keep her voice level despite her growing irritation. "This flag represents our support for her. Surely there's some flexibility." "Your personal feelings don't supersede HOA regulations," Margaret interrupted, handing over the written warning she prepared. "Compliance is mandatory within 72 hours or fines will begin accumulating at $50 per day. I'm sure as doctors, you and your husband understand the importance of following established protocols." Carlos appeared behind Maria, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. He'd been unpacking medical textbooks in the home office when he overheard the conversation. "We'll review the materials," he said, his tone professionally neutral but his eyes assessing Margaret with the same careful attention he gave difficult patients. "Excellent," Margaret replied, mentally categorizing the Rodriguez family as potentially problematic but potentially manageable. The next HOA meeting is Thursday at 7 p.m. in the community center. New residents are encouraged to attend. As Margaret walked away with the precise, measured steps that had earned her the neighborhood nickname, the HOA Terminator, she missed the determined look that crossed Maria's face. What Margaret didn't know was that Maria Rodriguez had spent her life standing up to bullies, first as an immigrant child in a new school, then as one of the few women in her medical program, and later as a doctor fighting insurance companies for her patients. An HOA president with a clipboard didn't scare her. "So that's the infamous Margaret," Carlos said quietly. "Yes," Maria replied, closing the door. "The neighbors warned me about her when I was planting yesterday. Apparently, she's used to getting her way." Carlos smiled, recognizing the tone in his wife's voice. "Should I be worried?" "Not about me," Maria answered, already flipping through the HOA handbook with the same focus she used when researching difficult medical cases. "But Margaret might need to be." The flag stayed up, the garden expanded, and Margaret's blood pressure rose to dangerous levels. Friday came and went with no changes at 238 Sycamore Lane. Margaret had driven past the house 3 times that day, each pass revealing the pride flag still fluttering defiantly in the spring breeze. By Sunday, not only had the Rodriguez family failed to remove the unauthorized flag, but Maria had added a second raised bed to her vegetable garden, this one containing what appeared to be tomatillos and jalapenos, plants that weren't on the approved list of residential vegetation for Oak Ridge Estates. Margaret documented each violation meticulously, her camera roll filling with time-stamped evidence. She'd expected compliance, not defiance. Most residents capitulated after the first warning, perhaps with some grumbling, but they ultimately recognized her authority. This outright dismissal of the rules was unprecedented during her 15-year reign. "They're making a mockery of everything we've established," Margaret fumed to Gerald over dinner, stabbing her chicken breast with uncharacteristic aggression. "Do they think the rules don't apply to them because they're doctors?" Gerald chewed thoughtfully before responding, a habit he developed over decades of marriage to avoid aggravating his wife. "Maybe they just need more time to adjust. They seem like nice people." "Nice people follow the rules, Gerald," Margaret replied, her fork clattering against the plate. "I'm giving them one more warning before the fines begin." The second warning notice, printed on the HOA letterhead's premium cardstock in bold red font, didn't produce the desired effect either. By the end of the month, Margaret had issued 17 violations to the Rodriguez family, documenting everything from the unauthorized vegetable varieties to the children's basketball hoop installed 2 inches higher than regulation, to the golden retriever who sometimes sat unleashed on their front lawn despite never leaving the property. When the Rodriguez family didn't pay the accumulating fines, Margaret escalated to her nuclear option, placing a lion against their property. It was a tactic she employed twice before against particularly stubborn homeowners, both times resulting in immediate compliance and, in one case, a hasty sale of the property. Margaret filed the paperwork herself at the county office, a satisfied smile playing at her lips as she handed over the documents. "Let's see how they respond to this," she told Patricia Whitman during their now-daily phone calls about the situation. "Nothing gets through to some people until you hit them where it hurts, their equity." What Margaret hadn't anticipated was that Carlos Rodriguez specialized in healthcare law before becoming a doctor. Over dinner that night, as Maria recounted finding the lion notice in their mailbox, Carlos' expression shifted from frustration to something resembling professional interest. "She's overstepping," he said, reaching for his laptop. "Several of these supposed violations aren't even supported by the HOA documents she provided. And the process for placing a lion requires a formal hearing that never occurred." The couple began documenting every interaction with Margaret, including her increasingly frequent inspections of their property, which sometimes occurred 3 times a day. Carlos installed discreet security cameras that captured Margaret standing at the edge of their property line, photographing their home from various angles. Maria started a spreadsheet tracking the times and dates of these surveillance activities, noting that they often occurred when most neighbors were at work. "This isn't just about a flag anymore," Maria said one evening, reviewing the growing documentation of Margaret's behavior. "This is harassment." Carlos nodded, his expression grim. "And we're going to prove it." Belina, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward. "Are we going to have to take down my flag?" Maria and Carlos exchanged a look before Maria wrapped an arm around their daughter's shoulders. "No, Carino. That flag stays right where it is. Margaret Holloway is about to learn that some battles aren't worth fighting. What the Rodriguez family didn't realize was that Margaret had called an emergency HOA board meeting for the following evening. The only agenda item, addressing the continued non-compliance at 238 Sycamore Lane and enforcement options. Margaret had spent 20 years in corporate management before retirement. She knew how to build coalitions and leverage power. This was war, and she intended to win it. By midsummer, Oak Ridge Estates had transformed from a seemingly harmonious community into a neighborhood visibly divided. The conflict between Margaret and the Rodriguez family had forced residents to take sides, creating an invisible boundary that everyone recognized but no one openly acknowledged, at least not when Margaret might overhear. Team Margaret consisted primarily of longtime residents who had bought into her vision of property value preservation above all else. They were the original Oak Ridge homeowners who remembered when the development was just an ambitious model home and a sales pitch about exclusivity. These supporters, roughly 15 households, most of them retirees, nodded approvingly during Margaret's impassioned speeches at HOA meetings about maintaining standards and community cohesion. Team Rodriguez, however, came as a surprise. It began with younger families who had moved in during the last 5 years, but soon expanded to include unexpected allies. Even Dolores Freeman, who had lived across from Margaret for a decade and previously supported every bylaw's amendment, switched allegiances after Maria helped her grandson during an asthma attack while waiting for an ambulance. That doctor saved Tyler, Dolores told her bridge club, several of whom were Margaret loyalists. And all Margaret cares about is whether their dog sits on the lawn without a leash. The animal doesn't even bark. The divide surprised Margaret, who had always assumed her neighbors appreciated her dedication to maintaining property values. But many residents had apparently been harboring resentments about her micromanagement for years. The Rodriguez family's resistance had broken a dam of silence, and suddenly everyone had a story. The Williams family's battle over their son's basketball hoop, the Paddles' fight to install solar panels, the Clarks' ongoing war about their non-conforming mailbox. Signs of rebellion emerged across the neighborhood. Anonymous letters appeared in Margaret's mailbox, carefully typed notes asking her to resign from the board. Families began to put up their own garden beds in solidarity with the Rodriguez family. Decorative flags, sports teams, universities, and even a few more pride flags appeared on porches that had previously displayed nothing more controversial than seasonal wreaths. The most shocking betrayal came when Margaret discovered her prize-winning rose bushes, 3-time winners in the county garden competition, covered in toilet paper one morning. She stood in her bathrobe at 6 a.m., staring in disbelief at the white streamers fluttering in the morning breeze, her carefully pruned thorny branches now looking like ghoulish Halloween decorations. "This is vandalism," she sputtered to the police officer who responded to her call. "I don't want fingerprints taken and a full investigation." The young officer, clearly suppressing a smile, explained that toilet papering wasn't a high-priority crime and suggested she simply clean it up. "You don't understand," Margaret insisted, her voice rising. "This is coordinated neighborhood harassment." That evening, as she and Gerald sat on their patio, the one place in their yard not visible to neighbors, Margaret's composure finally cracked. "They're destroying everything we've built," she said, her voice uncharacteristically vulnerable as she stared at her vandalized roses. 15 years of maintaining standards, protecting our investments, building a community where people are proud to live, and now they're acting like I'm the villain." Gerald watched his wife carefully before speaking. In their 40 years of marriage, he learned when to stay silent and when to intervene. "Maybe it's time to let someone else take the reins," he suggested gently. "You've given so much time to the HOA. You could focus on your gardening, maybe join that book club you've mentioned." His suggestion had exactly the opposite effect he'd intended. Margaret's spine straightened, her moment of vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "Retire? Now?" She set her wine glass down with a decisive click. "That's exactly what they want. They're testing me, Gerald. This is when true leaders hold the line." As darkness fell over Oak Ridge Estates, Margaret began drafting a new set of proposed bylaw amendments on her laptop, her fingers stabbing at the keys with military precision. If the neighborhood thought they could force her out with toilet paper and anonymous notes, they had severely underestimated Margaret Holloway's resolve. The emergency HOA meeting had not gone according to plan. Despite Margaret's careful preparation, including a PowerPoint presentation documenting every Rodriguez family violation with time-stamped photographs, several board members had questioned whether the situation warranted such aggressive enforcement. "They seem like good neighbors," Tom Wilson had said, a comment that felt like betrayal to Margaret. "Their house looks well-maintained, and that garden actually gives me some ideas for my backyard." Even worse, Patricia Whitman, her most reliable ally, had suggested a cooling-off period, where they would temporarily suspend the fines to allow for mediation. The final vote on proceeding with further action against the Rodriguez family had been a stunning tie, with Margaret having to use her tie-breaking power as president to continue the enforcement actions. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She paced her immaculate living room, ruminating on how quickly her authority was eroding. The Rodriguez family wasn't just defying her, they were inspiring others to question her leadership. Her neighborhood was slipping through her fingers, and with it, the only real purpose she found since retirement. At 1:38 a.m., Margaret made a decision that would change everything. If the garden was such a contentious issue, she would solve the problem directly. She changed from her nightgown into black pants and a dark sweater, practical clothing for gardening, she told herself, not an acknowledgement that what she planned might be wrong. In her garage, she gathered her tools, precision gardening shears, work gloves, and a commercial-grade weed killer. She purchased to battle particularly stubborn dandelions along her fence line. The bottle carried warning labels about keeping it away from edible plants and waterways, but Margaret barely glanced at them as she slipped it into a canvas bag. The streets of Oak Ridge Estates were silent as Margaret walked the 4 blocks to the Rodriguez home, her footsteps impossibly loud in her own ears. A rational part of her mind screamed that this was crossing a line, but another part, the part that couldn't bear losing control, propelled her forward. The gate to the Rodriguez backyard was unlocked, swinging open with a slight creak that made Margaret freeze momentarily. When no lights appeared in the house, she continued onto the property, the beam of her small flashlight illuminating the raised garden beds that had become the symbol of defiance in her mind. Margaret worked methodically, the way she approached everything in life. She started with the tomato plants, cutting them at the base with her shears. Next came the peppers and herbs, each snip feeling more satisfying than the last. Finally, she uncapped the weed killer, beginning to spray it liberally across the soil of both raised beds, ensuring nothing would grow there again without major remediation. "This is for their own good," she whispered to herself as she worked. "Property values affect everyone. Rules maintain order. Without order, there's chaos." Margaret was so focused on her task that she didn't notice when her flashlight beam triggered the motion sensor on one of the security cameras tucked discreetly under the eaves of the house. She didn't see the alert ping on Carlos's phone as he worked the night shift at the hospital, or the text he immediately sent to Maria, who was home with the children. She was completely unprepared when powerful floodlights suddenly illuminated the yard with daylight brightness, temporarily blinding her. An alarm sounded, not a house alarm, but a piercing security notification that seemed designed to alert the entire neighborhood. Margaret stood frozen in place, weed killer still dripping from the spray nozzle onto her shoes as the back door of the house flew open. Maria Rodriguez appeared in a bathrobe, her face a mixture of shock and grim confirmation. "I knew it was you," Maria said, her voice steady despite the hour and the circumstances. "We found our plants damaged last week, but I didn't want to believe someone would do this intentionally." Before Margaret could formulate a response, what could she possibly say while standing in their yard with shears and poison? Carlos appeared on Maria's phone screen. He was using FaceTime from the hospital, his face grave in the harsh lighting of the break room. "Don't move, Margaret," he said, his voice coming clearly through the speaker. "The police are on their way, and we have everything on video from our security cameras. This time, you've gone too far."